All right, thanks everybody for joining us today on this material webinar for choosing the right material for your microfluidic application. I've got Duncan from Parallel here. He's going to talk us through this presentation and give us a little bit of insight on the topic. A couple of housekeeping things. We do have a Q&A panel, so if you see at the bottom of your screen, you can click Q&A and ask any questions that you have in that panel. At the end of the presentation, we'll take a few minutes and get through as many of those questions as we can for the group. Otherwise, feel free to, or after the webinar, we will be sending out a copy of the presentation as well as the recording. So you can expect that to come in your inbox within a couple of days. And with that, Duncan, I'll flip it over to you and have a great presentation.
Thanks, Nick, for the introduction. I'm really looking forward to speaking about materials as it relates to microfluidics today. And my goal for this presentation is to provide just some useful insights and an overview of thermoplastic materials to help you choose the best material that you need for your microfluidic application. But before we dive into all the technical stuff, just a little bit about me. My title here at Parallel is as a microfluidics engineer, which is our way of saying that I'm not just doing mechanical engineering work, I'm also doing a little bit of material science work, as well as just application-specific microfluidics projects. Before working at Parallel, I got my master's at MIT in mechanical engineering and my bachelor's at Oregon State University. And over the years, I developed a bit of a background building organ-on-a-chip microfluidic systems. And I also worked on a lot of flow cytometers and lab instruments, as well as a short stint working in the soft robotics realm, which is where I first kind of got interested in materials. And in all of these fields, I've really realized just how important choosing the right material is. And so hopefully today I can help you out with that. But before we get into the materials, just a little bit about Parallel. Here, we are experts in rapidly manufacturing microfluidic devices. And in our process, we're able to build prototypes that actually resemble final microfluidic products. We're also able to offer integrated components that make our devices much easier to use. For example, fluidic connectors, as well as holders for chips. And we have a lot of stuff on the horizon that you'll see come out in the near future. But the big selling point of our process is that we are much faster and we save time and money when you're comparing us to an injection molding partner. But our components are made of the same types of materials and they very closely resemble an actual injection molded part. So a little overview of the presentation today. I'll start with just an overview of the different types of materials that have historically been used in microfluidics. And then I'll dive a lot deeper into the materials we use at Parallel, which includes PMMA, polycarbonate, COC, and COP materials. And then I really hope to answer one of the most frequent questions we get here at Parallel, which is how to choose between COC and COP materials, because they are actually quite similar materials. And then I'll give a little bit more of an overview of some different material properties and just highlight other considerations that you might make when you're thinking about your prototypes. So the history of microfluidics is really just inspired by what happened in the electronics world. As people started to use lithographic processes to make electronic circuits, researchers in the fluidics realm were inspired by scaling down fluidic circuits as well. If you can speed up processes and make things more efficient in the electronics world, why wouldn't that work for microfluidics? And so this was the first thing that people started using to actually make microfluidic devices out of silicon and glass. And those were the first common materials used. However, it requires a lot of expensive equipment. So you really need a dedicated microfab to produce devices out of these materials. And you need expensive photolithography equipment, and the processes are also a little bit hazardous with all sorts of etching steps and kind of involved bonding procedures. One of the outcomes of using silicon and glass is that you get a surface on your device that's saturated with negative charge. And there are some benefits to that. One, it promotes wetting, and you can also use those negative charges to actually create a flow inside of a device. But the downside is that those negative charges can also create surface binding effects to proteins and other molecules. So sometimes devices also need a coating or some sort of procedure to remove any bound particles. And then the main downside is that these devices are just much more expensive than any of the other material options. And it was impacting the research field so much that it was a huge win when researchers started using PDMS. And if you've worked in a lab doing microfluidics work, you've probably worked with PDMS. And it essentially is just a very high purity form of silicone. Some of the advantages of PDMS is that it's gas permeable. So if you're culturing cells in a device, they can actually get oxygen, for example, and it's highly biocompatible. You know, it's great for cell culture, but it's safe to eat even. And it's really easy to produce these devices using molds that were made using a lithographic process, but you can also machine and 3D print molds and create device prototypes, even just in a lab. The downsides to PDMS is that it's really hard to make PDMS devices at scale. And the other just technical disadvantage to PDMS is that it has these major issues with small molecule adsorption and absorption. And I want to touch on that in a little bit more detail because it'll be important with some of our other materials. And so just to clarify, the effect of adsorption is whenever a molecule binds to the actual surface of a material, any kind of material. And it's common across all sorts of material families because molecules just generally tend to bind to a surface. A worse phenomenon is absorption, which is a volumetric phenomenon where molecules will actually dissolve into the polymer matrix. And it's been shown time and time again that PDMS absorbs molecules into the polymer matrix. And the issue with this is if you're studying the dose of a drug or the presence of some hormone or molecule, and it's going into your actual device and not actually into your reagents, you get variable results and you don't have any sort of predictability out of what you're actually studying. And so I want to highlight that in terms of both adsorption and absorption, all of the thermoplastics we're talking about today offer a major improvement over PDMS and glass microfluidics. And I'll show which ones are the best options. But the other thing that I just want to highlight for specific applications, these things can be impacted by surface modification. So if you're using a plasma step or any sort of coatings or something that's changing the surface, you will actually see a change in the behavior of the material. And so the best thing to do is to always just take whatever it is you're trying to study, whatever compound, and just see how well you recover it inside of your device using whatever chemical assay you have available. So let's talk a little bit about thermoplastics in general. They are just a much more cost-effective alternative to glass and PDMS in microfluidics. And they actually are a really outperforming material in a lot of ways. All the materials we're talking about today are amorphous thermoplastics. That means it doesn't have a crystal structure. And what that enables is that these materials have more similar optical properties to glass. And they also are able to reproduce very small features in a molding and replication process. They're also generally low shrinkage, so you can actually get highly accurate devices out of these materials. The other thing about them being amorphous is that they can be bonded using heat and pressure. And the reason for this is they don't actually have a specific melting point. They just gradually soften at elevated temperatures. And you can use that to fuse the polymer back together and actually cap your microfluidic channels out of the same material. Another advantage is that the materials we're talking about today are all sterilizable using gamma, ETO, and also hydrogen peroxide vapor, which is becoming pretty popular in a lot of medical device industries. One of the main disadvantages to these thermoplastics is that they have limited gas permeability. So if you're trying to either add or remove a gas into your reagents, be it for an analytical application, or if you're trying to get oxygen in to culture cells, you'll have to think about that when you actually build these devices and have some additional component that provides oxygen, or just account for it in how you actually design and scale your device. So speaking about these materials on a case-by-case basis, PMMA has long been used in all sorts of optical devices, academic projects, and has been a long-standing material used for droplet-based microfluidics. It's a great material because there's a lot of manufacturers making acrylic or PMMA, and it's also relatively low cost. Polycarbonate is used often when temperature is required. So if you either need to go and use your device in a cryogenic application or perform thermal cycling over it, it's a good choice. Most commonly in microfluidics, it's used for PCR reactions. And like PMMA, there's a lot of manufacturers and it's pretty affordable. The other family of materials that we'll talk about today are the cyclic olefin materials, COC and COP, which are great for building organ-on-a-chip systems, screening platforms, and diagnostic tools. And they're also really great if you have any sort of high sensitivity assays, especially involving optics. There are fewer manufacturers of these materials and fewer grades available, and they come at a slightly higher cost as compared to PMMA and polycarb. But I want to just highlight that if you're working with us over here at Parallel, we're talking about grams of material, and so we don't actually factor in the cost of material when we're evaluating stuff at the prototype scale. So let's break down each material a little bit more in detail, starting with PMMA. This is kind of our workhorse microfluidics plastic. It works for most applications, and it's actually just a really great cost-effective material. It's compatible with fats and oils and has really low processing temperatures, which makes it easy to work with. And the other thing I want to highlight about PMMA is that it actually has really great UV transmission characteristics and all across the board, just great optical properties. The downside to PMMA is that it does have some limited solvent resistance. So if you're using alcohols or acetone, it's not going to be the best material for those applications. Another thing to watch out for is that when certain PMMA grades are impact modified, they have a drop in UV transmission. And so that's just something you have to watch out for on a grade by grade basis. I'll talk about impact modifiers a little bit more later on in the presentation. Polycarbonate, like I said, is a great temperature resistant material. And so anytime you're thermal cycling in particular, where you're kind of heating and cooling your device, it's a great material for that. It's also our best mechanical performer. It's really impact resistant, so it's never going to break, and it's relatively ductile too, and you can kind of flex the material. And it also has a bit better chemical resistance than PMMA. The downside to polycarbonate is some of the optical properties. Namely, it has a really high index of refraction. So unless you're doing something where you're trying to build a lens into a device and you need high optical power, that's usually a disadvantage. The other thing is that the material is, it has a relatively high dispersion. So you'll get a slight blue tint, especially when you hold your devices at an angle. And generally, the material is a more fluorescent and UV light absorbing material than the other materials we're talking about. It's also not great with some organic solvents and also basic solutions. And if you're not careful, you can actually break down polycarbonate into some kind of unfavorable compounds, such as BPA and some other toxic chemicals. Polycarbonate also has just been a really common material over the years in microfluidics. It was popular all the way back in the early days when it was used in the eyeglass industry. Microfluidics kind of followed suit with polycarb because you can actually replicate small features and get pretty good optical quality out of those devices. So the next group of materials, which are quite similar, are the cyclic olefins. And we'll start with COC, which is a cyclic olefin copolymer. And these materials are temperature resistant. They have great optical properties. They resist most solvents. They don't absorb much water. They're largely non-polar surface chemistry, and you can reproduce really small features out of this material. The only real disadvantages are that they are not as compatible with fats and oils. And in COC in particular, the temperature resistant grades are typically brittle and a little bit harder to process than some of the lower temperature COC grades. And that's just due to a higher norbornene content in the polymer. And then the other thing in COC is that it is a kind of randomized polymerization reaction. And so you just have to make sure you pay attention to quality control on those materials and make sure you're getting consistent properties batch to batch in COC. The similar material to COC is COP, which is using a similar process to create a similar polymer. But this is just a homogeneous polymer that has functionally very similar properties to COC, but it is a bit more stable than COC, making it really good for pharmaceutical and diagnostic applications. And it's our highest purity optical grade polymer. So you're going to have the least amount of quality control issues, off-gassing, or any other sort of disadvantages. COP has been used a lot in packaging biologic drugs because it's a very stable material and far outperforms glass for things like packaging vaccines or other types of biologic drugs. The other cons to COP are that there are only so many suppliers of the material, and as such, there are also fewer medically certified grades of COP and also fewer extrusion-capable grades of COP. So we'll break down a couple other things that help you choose between COC and COP. The main one that I want to highlight is that COC has a much higher ethylene content, and the ethylene content on COC is oriented outwards from the polymer, so it's kind of more exposed to the surfaces and has a bit larger effect on the overall properties of the polymer. The reason they do this is it actually reduces the cost of COC, making it easier for the manufacturer to process and produce. And you can also tailor the grades a bit more to make it suitable for film extrusion processes. It also makes it easier to blend and modify the resins if you want to tailor the properties even further. That ethylene content also improves some of the adhesion and bonding properties over COP. And the other thing that you can do is if you push the ethylene content to 40 or 50%, you can actually get a semi-crystalline grade of COC that turns it into an elastomer. So if you need a gasketing material or something stretchy, it's a lot easier to do that in a COC material. COP, however, is a bit more stable, and it's just one monomer in the species. So you're basically just changing the molecular weight in that material. And it's great for all sorts of diagnostic applications. It is not as brittle as COC, so it's a bit more flexible. It makes it better for larger parts because they can eject from a mold a little bit easier. Another thing that's cool about COP is even though it's a little harder to extrude, it is compatible with COC film. So you can actually have a heterogeneous assembly of a COC and COP material. And then just in general, I say that it's a much better material for high temperature applications, not because there aren't high temperature grades of COC, but because the high temperature grades of COP are more flexible and just a lot easier to process and injection mold. So a couple other considerations. One, watch out for impact modifiers. These are an additive into a polymer that's typically an elastomeric compound that makes the material easier to flex without breaking. But the downside of these little compounds is that they reduce UV transmission and often require to use a UV stabilizer, which reduces the UV properties of your polymer. It's really common in a lot of PMMA grades, but not what I would recommend for a microfluidic chip, especially since a lot of them are not stressed mechanically. The one place that you'll maybe see them is on the actual film in PMMA, and that is a little bit less of a concern because it's a thin layer of material, and that just makes it a bit easier to handle those PMMA films. In terms of temperature resistance, COC and COP are usually safe for any applications involving water because they're stable up to the boiling point. And polycarb is usually suggested above 100 degrees C, or if you're kind of cycling the temperatures on your device. Oh, I go back. In terms of hydrophobicity, all of the materials we've talked about today they tend to be more hydrophobic than plasma treated PDMS and glass. And of the four materials, COC and COP are definitely the most hydrophobic materials. So if you need that for your application, I would recommend the cyclic olefins. And lastly, in terms of regulatory compliance, here at Parallel, we're trying to provide materials that actually meet biocompatibility standards. And so we're looking for polymers that are basically USP class 4 and ISO 10993-1 certified. So I want to highlight just a couple other materials that you might see out there. Polystyrene is a really common one in microfluidics, and a lot of lab consumables are made of polystyrene. And even though it's been used a lot over the years, there are some thermal properties that make thermal bonding difficult. And I would say that it's just generally better for monolithic components. So like a plate, it's a much better material for doing something like that. But if you do need to make your device out of polystyrene, translating a PMMA prototype works really well if you want to move into production with polystyrene, because you're going to get really similar behavior out of the prototype. In terms of fluoropolymers, sometimes people will use these if they're working with something like a chlorinated solvent or some other highly aggressive chemical, but they have a lot of other disadvantages like haze and fluorescence. They're not really optical polymers. The other place that I've seen them used is in droplet-based microfluidic systems, so like digital droplet systems in particular, where you're leveraging processes like electrowetting. But sometimes if you really need a fluoropolymer, you can also get away with the fluoropolymer coating, something like that that's deposited by a fluorinated oil as a secondary procedure in the device assembly. And then lastly, in terms of semi-crystalline polymers, we don't work with these as frequently. They're sometimes used in fluidic manifolds and some sort of like connectors and other fluidic instrumentation. But they don't generally have good optical qualities. They're not as good in thermal processes, so it's harder to get small features when injection molding them. And they're much more difficult to bond than the amorphous materials we've been talking about today. One last sort of like technical thing that I want to cover are chemical resistance. So we'll just kind of move left to right. If you're working with alcohols, so IPA or ethanol, the PMMA grade that we use is actually certified for ethanol wipe downs and short exposures to IPA. It's not necessarily the best option if you're going to have a long residence time of that chemical. But if you just need to wipe something with ethanol, it's usually a good material for that. But if you're going to be working with them a lot, I definitely recommend just switching over to COC or COP. Watch out for acetone with PMMA and polycarb. Watch out for fats and oils with the cyclic olefin materials. And then in terms of other chemical compatibility, you're just going to have a much better time with COC and COP. The only things they don't really resist are chlorinated solvents and some highly nonpolar solvents as well, like cyclohexane and toluene. A couple other properties that I just want to highlight. One, you can see here that COC has a much lower elongation at break than the other materials. So that's the brittleness I'm talking about. PMMA has a much lower glass transition temperature, which in some ways improves your processing because it's easier to work with, but it's not as good for high temperature applications. PMMA and polycarb also absorb a bit more water than any of our other plastics. But usually for a microfluidic application, if it's sort of like a single pass device and you're not going to be holding water in there for many hours or days, they're fine materials to be working with. And then lastly, you can see some of the disadvantages in polycarb where it has a higher index and not as good optical transmission. So in summary, PMMA is just a great general purpose polymer used for all sorts of prototyping. It has better optical performance than a lot of people give it credit for at the trade-off of some reduced solvent resistance. Polycarb is great for high temperature and thermal cycling applications, and it's definitely our best mechanical performer, but not as good optical performance. COC and COP are almost always just the best materials to be using, and you can generally use them interchangeably. They are slightly higher cost at the production volumes than PMMA and polycarb. But again, microfluidic devices are very small and very high value. So usually material cost is not the biggest contender when you're thinking about production cost. And lastly, COP does offer slightly improved performance over COC, especially if you have larger parts or things that are high temperature because they are just less brittle. If you want to compare properties of our materials, sort of apples to apples, just head to our website, go to the design guide, scroll down to the bottom where it says materials, and we actually have consistent material data sheets that'll enable you to compare properties between materials. And they also have a bit of an overview that just talks about what the materials are actually used for. When you upload your parts, it's super easy to upload it. You can request a material in advance, or you can just upload your part and we'll kind of give you an estimate with the different materials that we offer. And it's as easy as just selecting a drop-down if you want to configure the material of your actual part. And before I let you go and we move to the Q&A, I just want to say why work with us. Here at Parallel, we offer a quick turnaround, faster than really anything else in the industry. You can get a quote for your part within hours, and our standard lead time is 2 weeks. But if you're in a rush, you can expedite that up to 3 days. Our prototypes are production quality, and they are way faster than if you wanted to get an injection molded prototype. They're made of real materials that you'll actually make your device out of in the long run. And the chips arrive ready to use. Part of that is that there are integrated components that we offer. So we have fluidic connectors and reservoirs that are welded onto our chips without the use of adhesives. And that's just an optional way to kind of speed up your testing process. And lastly, we do offer devices in what we call core format sizes. And these are just standard sizes of a microscope slide, a double slide, and a well plate. And this guarantees that those devices will be compatible with our components and any of the accessories we offer. And the other benefit you get is that it will speed up your lead time to 1 week. So you're just going to get your parts faster if you just closely follow the design guidelines and choose a core format size. So I encourage you to upload your parts and we can give you some feedback, help you choose a material, and get you up and running with your device. If you have specific material questions or like application-specific microfluidic questions, shoot me an email, duncan@parallelfluidics.com, and I will happily answer those questions. And that leads us to the Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Duncan. Appreciate all of the great information we had there. Couple questions coming through, and a reminder to anybody else, if you click the Q&A button in your Zoom panel, you should be able to type in and ask any questions that you might have. So one question have come in is, can you talk a little bit more about the actual manufacturing process, specifically with this person's looking to know more about the PMMA material? You know, is that injection molded? Like, what does that actual process sort of look like?
It's a great question. The first thing that I will say is I encourage you to go and go onto our website and watch our previous webinar, which actually talks about this in much more detail. Our process is something we call transition molding. It is a soft tool-based process that sort of blurs the lines between embossing and injection molding, where your parts are actually made of a certified injection molding grade material, and we replicate features on those parts. We can then take those parts and actually do secondary machining operations on them. And also we cap the parts so we can actually seal the channels with a film. But in general, it's a replication-based process using heat to form features in the device.
Wonderful. So another question coming in here, and I know we had another webinar that dove a little bit further into this, but what about feature sizes? What's sort of the smallest feature size that you guys can support? And does that change between materials?
Yes. So because we're making these basically tools to replicate features, you're really following traditional guidelines for micro machining because we're using small end mills to produce features. And the smallest end mill that we can produce is like a 50 micron end mill. So a lot of the times the minimum radius that we're is a 50 micron radius in those features. A lot of this, I think, is just a lot easier to scout out on the web page. Our design guideline has all sorts of different features and they're all spec'd out. So if you want to see those types of features and just relate that to your device, you can very quickly see whether your device is within our guidelines.
Great. Another question. Person is wondering if you can work with a mixture of materials within the process that's not injection molding, and also if you work with Flexidim.
Yeah, so what I will say is that we don't do any blending of polymers or anything. We don't do any crazy polymer science stuff. We're just working with like injection molding grades of material. So, you know, those things we can't mix and match those. In terms of Flexidim, that's like a styrenic block copolymer elastomer. And we haven't started working with thermoplastic elastomers yet. I think there are definitely opportunities on the horizon for that. And I know that Flexidim is a certified embossing material, but we've never worked with it in the past. So I think you could definitely, you know, open a conversation with us and we could kind of talk through that. But I would think that it's a little bit more on the R&D side for us since we haven't been working with thermoplastic elastomers yet.
And then another one sort of touching on the design guide side of things. Are you able to overcome some of the limitations that come with injection molding? Or are they basically the same sort of, you know, design guide or, you know, design rules to follow that you would with an injection mold?
Yeah, our goal is not to replace injection molding, but rather help you build a device and then walk away with it knowing that you can injection mold it. So ideally, the parts that we are producing follow similar guidelines to injection molding so that you can take your parallel part and work with an injection molding partner to actually produce it at scale. So we're talking about very similar design guidelines.
Right. And then one more question here. So can you surface modify the COC or COP materials?
Yeah, so surface modifications in the cyclic olefins is definitely possible. They are a non-polar surface with fewer opportunities to build functional groups on them, but you can totally do it. So they are able to be plasma treated, and you can modify those surfaces with coatings and other things. We don't currently do coatings here at Parallel. It's something that we're looking into, and it might be an offering in the future, but COC and COP can both be modified.
Awesome. And with that, we're a little bit over time, so I will let everyone go. Thank you again, Duncan, for a great presentation. And then a reminder to everybody on the line, the slides as well as a recording of the webinar will be available. We'll send them out via email within a day or two.
Thanks so much.